held
liable.
liable for it, and so it tends to be the same people year after year after year. The school system pays off their debt and they start all over again.
Just yes, ma'am. How many children are we sort of talking about?
When I looked today, I would say 15 that owe more than $50.
But now we've got two that have like $600 and $800.
No, we don't have any that high right now.
Okay, did they?
Those were from last
You
year.
had those from
They're
last year.
not, they might be, the school may have that in their budget, but it's not part of mine anymore.
Contact principals, they're not gonna pay it, if they don't pay it, then we'll take action, but I've never,
We threatened.
we've never followed.
And the response I got from that survey, they emailed me back the other day and said there were only 4 districts in the state that were actually using a company like that. And I asked if they could share who they were, what companies they were, and what kind of percentage they were having to pay, and they didn't have that data yet to share with me.
We do still, we do still use a company called Next Check. We've used them for years. If they write us a bad check, they'll keep dinging against their account. So if we could get the people that don't pay just to write us a bad check.
Just tell them they write us.
There you go.
Check, straight off.
Outside the box, a lot of the churches that fund, that sort of help sponsor some of the schools. You know, I wonder if the schools have contacted the church to see if they would be willing to.
I know Clyde
come up
had,
with some funds to.
it's a Brommel Bridge, what is it? There was one group that's helped Riverbend and Clyde, but we also have Laura Inman that has contacted Lions Clubs, Rotary, churches, and so each school has a pot of money for kids, not necessarily to pay off meal charges, but it's for kids that might be on free, reduced, or paid lunch, that after they buy their lunch, they're still hungry, but don't have funds to buy more.
Okay.
So that money is used to give them extra fruits and vegetables or an entree. They can't use it for snacks, but
Because their goal
we
was
have
no
those
child
funds for
hunger.
that.
Right, okay.
Thank you, Allison. Good work. Jason?
Y'all know? Thank you, Allison.
Thank you for.
Easy, if you can go down, let's skip that, but we'll come back to that.
Let me have,
Yeah, keep going. Right here, yeah. One of the things that, when you're talking about cutting a budget like this, the HR has to do is figure out where the people gone, and then where are we gonna get these cuts from as far as 22 people. This is a chart that takes the SS200 report that we turn into DPI every year in October, and it goes back to 2007, and it breaks it down into the state classifications and shows you the reductions over the last 8 years. So for example, Dr. Garrett was talking about the cuts in state money that results in fewer teachers. You can start, over here in 2007 and work your way to the left and see how many reductions that is. For example, in number 5, elementary teachers, 280 in 07-08, down to 247 this year. 100 secondary teachers. Now, when we talk about secondary, the state has some odd classification names. For secondary, they're just talking about core classes, math, science, social studies, and English. So you've got 100 down to 74. Then they classify everyone else in secondary as other teachers. So that's the, music, art, CPE, ROTC, people like that. And so you see 168, that one's actually gone up a little bit. And then guidance personnel from 24 to 19, and you can kind of just go on down the list. I won't read them all to you. Another big one is number 13, teacher assistants, from 155 down to 105. Secretaries and clerical folk, 72 down to 59 this year. Service workers and skilled craftsmen in Joe's department, 150 down to 111. And so the total overall, you see, we went from 1,079 employees in 07-08 to 952 in 15-16.
Jason, other teachers is all grade levels.
That's all grade levels, yes. Yeah, the elementary teachers are classroom teachers, and then the other is,
PE and thing for all
PE,
grades.
that's all PE and all grade
Art.
K-12. Any questions there? This is a chart that we got back this year. What the state does is they do a teacher turnover report that we send to them with SS200. Use those two reports to kind of figure your staff. This one counts the number of teachers by school from March to March. And that's a pretty good way of doing it because you don't have all that flux in the summer in it then. You know, if you had them in March and you got them the next March, then that's a pretty good way to do it. So you can see the number of teachers in March of 2014. We don't have this last one yet, but and you can kind of see the amount of turnover in each school. And some of that's a lot of retirement, some of it is teachers coming out of the counties, some of it's termination, not a lot. You can kind of see where it was that year. So for 2015, we won't get that data till next March, you see. They'll count it from 14 to 16, or 15 to 16. So what our current rate is 11.49%, which is about 3% less than the state average. Any questions about that?
Do you have an idea of what you think it might be this March, for this past year, the percent?
It won't be much different than that. Every year we fluctuate between 40 and 60 teachers. The last 2 years it's been right at 60, both years. It's kind of interesting how it did that. But we usually run around 11%. Okay. Now this one shows you the categories of the teachers that left out of those 60, the reasons why. Code 66 there, you had 10 teachers that retired with full benefits, 1 was reduced. 1 didn't obtain or maintain the license they were supposed to have. We had 1 that was non-renewed that, and sometimes principals will document teachers that aren't performing very well in the first 2 years, 3 years. And they'll non-renew their contract, and usually those people resign and leave. This one would not, so that we had to non-renew them. Then you had 2 that moved to a non-teaching position in the LEA, and that's usually people moving up to be an assistant principal or some sort of administrator. 1 in a non-teaching position in another LEA. 14 resigned to teach in another public school system. Most of those went to Buncombe and Henderson counties, which pay a little more than we do. You had 1 resign to go to a non-public or private school, 8 to teach in another state. Most of those went to Georgia. Georgia, again, pays very, very well compared to us. 2 of them resigned, so they were dissatisfied with teaching and went into some other profession. 1 resigned with health disability. 8 did a career change. And that 8 and 2 there that resigned with dissatisfied with teaching, not everybody that does a different career doesn't like teaching or they don't like the way it's being done. They just want to make more money doing something else, or they get a better opportunity. Those 2 though, you know, when they mark that, when they've really gotten into something they probably shouldn't have, they were misplaced somewhere. 4 responsibility in child care. Usually that comes about where we have a young teacher who has a baby, says I'm gonna come back, has the baby, falls in love of course, and decides to stay home and take care of the baby.
Or takes care of the man.
Or take care of the parent. It's usually the maternity leave, and we understand that. And then 5 of them just weren't gonna tell us what they were doing.
Yeah.
Can't make them all, yeah.
Is this just teachers? This is just taking consideration
just
teachers,
teachers.
not other staff members or
Correct.
employees?
The only ones that state tracks are teachers, certified teachers.
Do we go back to the?
Yeah, let's go back to this. And now, let's drop down to the real important part. Right there. All right, now, the RIF policy, Dr. Garrett, Dr. Nolte, and I were sitting in there the other day trying to think the last time we actually used this policy. And that was about 10 years ago, and one employee was RIF'd and actually sent home due to a lack of employment or lack of funds or whatever. Most of the time what happens here when we have to cut positions is that 60 that left for some other reason, we absorb it that way and we just don't replace them. And hopefully that's what we can do this year. Typically that's the rotation, people retiring and going other places, and we can fit them in that way.
Or, we lose a position at school X, but there's an opening at school Y, and we transfer,
Any transfer.
if they have the right one.
Now, if it comes down to it where, and the only area that kind of worries me is the secondary level, where the certifications are much, much more specialized. And so if a high school principal, if you tell a high school principal you gotta cut 6 positions or 8 positions, just for an example, then they may pick an English, a math, a PE, whatever. And that may not be the people that we have retired from high school. And you can't really just go down to a social studies teacher and go, okay, now you're teaching math. That just doesn't work. In middle school, you can kind of get by with that. They can go take a practice and usually pass and teach it and do a pretty good job at it. In high school, it gets detailed and in-depth enough that just won't work. So in that case, we may have to come to you and say, we're going to have to RIF a couple positions where the principals don't need these teachers. The numbers are lower, depending on where the retirements and that and so forth are. Now, when that happens, Dr. Garrett and Dr. Nolte and the principals consult, and they determine where that is, and they come to you and they say, we either need to do English, math, whatever it is, those positions they need to cut. We need to do it at the school level, just one school, or we need to do it county-wide on that grade level. So we're going to consider all the high schools, or we're just going to do it at this one school. Now, in cuts this big, you're probably going to have to do it county-wide to get it. So they would come to you and say, this is what the principals have recommended. We need to do it county-wide, and then the policy comes into effect. How do you determine who those people are? So let's say that a principal has decided that they have lower numbers in PE. Let's just take PE for example. A lot of PE teachers. How do you decide which one now is not going to have a position? All right, so the criteria for the selection goes on performance evaluations. And what we would do is use the performance evaluations from the past 3 years, not this current year, because those could be manipulated and changed based on who. So the only fair way to do that would be the last 3 years, because they're already done. You would also consider anyone who had a letter in their file or some sort of disciplinary action. You could pull them out over anyone else. So once you and I can run reports that show this over the last 3 years for all PE teachers if we need to. And then what you would do,
You know how, like, over federal law, it would be impossible to go through and go, well, this one had this many distinguished marks and this many superior marks and this many proficient marks and this many below standard marks. And so on that first criteria, you basically be looking for people who had a below proficient mark or had what you were saying, a disciplinary action or some kind of action plan. So that's where you would look first, and you might get enough that you need out of that group. And then if you didn't get it out of that group, then you go to criteria two.
no, Yeah, so if all the PE teachers are proficient, and nobody's been marked below proficient, which is possible, then you could go on to number 2 here, which takes into account the length of service with the higher priority given to service in this school system. And the way the policy reads, it doesn't say anything about a break in service or coming and going. It just says, take the total amount of service in this county, and then you start comparing them. And you might get them that way, the number you need. If you don't, then we've got 4 more factors down here that you can consider in determining which ones you would take.
And 3, 4, and 5 are, I'm sorry, over-explained. They're essentially tiebreakers.
Yeah.
Because what you'd say is, well, we need, let's say, and I'm just making up a number, you need to cut 3 of those. Well, you might go down through years of experience, and you have 5 people with 3 years experience, and they're the least amount of experience in that area. Well, then you got your 3, but which of the 3, would be real? Then you go down to the next and say, how many licensure organizations? You might have 3 of them with a licensure in PE and biology and middle grades math and other stuff, and those would not be real.
One way to make this really clear is like, if I'm a high school principal and we're looking at ripping social studies, and I've got 4 teachers and all considered are equal, and I've got one that does the yearbook, guess who I want to keep? I want to keep having doing the yearbook. So that's where number 5 comes in, is when they do extra duty positions that you can't do without. But that's basically the RIF policy. I mean, all this up here talks about keeping a well-balanced program and all those things that we want to do, but when the rubber meets the road, this paragraph right here is what it boils down to.
That's better than the old one.
Oh, yeah.
Used to be,
that's
it
fair,
was
yeah.
just years of performance, and then you're like, oh, I gotta get rid of my good people.
Well, I was the principal when we revamped this,
I like
and we
that.
really fought for this
Yeah,
1 and 2.
And we talked to Pat about it, and
Yeah.
Dean about it while
Yeah.
we were doing it, to make it, if we ever had to do it, to make sure we didn't lose
Is
our
the new policies being written by the state board?
That's a 7,000 series,
Yeah.
it'll be out
Yeah.
next month, I think.
But we're gonna hold off on
we
that,
don't, we don't.
because we don't want it to be that we've just changed it just so that we can rip our people. Because we'd have to, I think it would be fair to grandfather them
different
in.
is it from this?
Do what?
How different is it?
I haven't even read it.
It's probably
We haven't seen it.
They've not been sent to us yet. Mark actually, Mark actually canceled the policy committee meeting the other day because the State School Board Association had not sent all of that series to us. So we really not.
The only part of that we've gotten so far is the drug testing part, we're working on that.
Well, if we didn't like what they said, we could still do this.
Yeah.
Well, this is our I'm sorry, I'm talking way too
No.
much. I do that when I'm nervous, and this right here will make you sick.
It'll make you
It won't just make you nervous, it'll make
That's
you
right,
sick.
I know.
But, you always operate on the policy that you have at that moment in time. You don't operate on what might happen,
That's right.
how many students you might
Right.
really have, or you operate on what you know, and that's what we
I'm
know.
assuming the state will come up with something that sounds like this, anyway.
They may have these criteria
In
in different
different
order,
order. Mhm.
but it'll be basically that. Any other questions?
Can we talk about our next topic, 2 or 3 different times, and I've had 2 or 3 different people to ask me to include this on the agenda for tonight. So Joe and Todd are actually going to talk about Central Elementary School. We talked about closing it, not closing it, what we can do, what we not do, what the savings would be, where our students would go. And they really have worked hard this week on trying to show us where those students would go, how the lines would be drawn, and then what your actual savings would be. So Joe and Todd.
Can we get somebody from technology for
Can you get him something to eat while he gets his thing?
Hopefully, I'm not.
And what do you do, Todd?
Transportation.
Yeah.
We've been doing much anyway.
All right. You know, when you're in charge of technology, you do hold your breath when it doesn't work because everybody expects it to work better for you than it does for everybody else. All right, what I'd like to do in just the next few minutes is to present to you to begin with, present three possible scenarios. If you were to choose to close Central Elementary School, how we might divide those district lines. And then the second thing that we'll do after we look at those three map scenarios of where those students might go, we'll look at what that would do to our school numbers compared to the actual capacity at those schools. And then finally, the last thing we'll look at is the actual cost savings that we can estimate based on what we're spending right now. And so what you have here is a map of Haywood County, and I know it's not very clear up there, but Bellwood, Lake Junaluska, Canton, Waynesville, and then back up toward Balsam, back out toward the 110-276 split. So that gives you an idea of where you're at, just to acclimate you. You can see that most of the students at Central Elementary School right now live in that Waynesville area, but there are a lot of students that don't. Central has a pre-K program, so you have about 16 students in the pre-K program, and those students come from all over the county. Central has the Bridges program. The Bridges program has up to 10, right now about 7 students in the Bridges program, which is a day treatment program. Those students come from all around the county. And then you have those students that have requested an out-of-district transfer to go to Central and have been accepted. So that is why that area is dispersed just a little bit.
And the ones that have requested are typically because a staff member works at the school, or a parent works near the school. A parent may work next door at Waynesville Middle, or they want the A+, even though they're not really funded it, they want the A+ slant that the school used to have.
So two very quick assumptions on all three of these maps. One is that if a student is out of district, they would automatically go back to their home school, not necessarily to another school of their choosing by another out-of-district request to Dr. Nolte. And the second thing, keep in mind, is all of this is based on what it would look like if today Central Elementary were closed and we moved those students. So when I was pulling that data, this is not a projection of what it would look like next year, but what these 248 kids that go there today, where they would go if tomorrow morning Central Elementary School were no longer there. And so you see that's where we're at kind of, really there, if we look in downtown Waynesville, I can pull this up and get it to a point that it looks, okay, I think that's a good enough place. The area around Love Lane, Dolan Road, there's a good portion of students that live there on back down into, off of Brown Avenue, off of Sulphur Springs. And then you have a group of students that live in the Denver community. And then you have a group of students that live in and around East Street. That's really the three communities that we're looking at. When we look at how we might divide that, of course, the most logical thing to look at is Junaluska Elementary and Haywood Elementary, simply because those are the two closest schools. And so the first scenario that you have here would basically divide that line at a very natural point. And that would be the Russ Avenue, Walnut Street, North Main, South Main division. So everything to the right of that line would go to one school, and everything to the left would go to the other school. That's basically an east-west split.
Okay, okay, sorry, Todd, okay, now, that split right there, which way is Lake Junaluska and
All right,
which
so
way?
the green would be Lake Junaluska, so East Street and this split, and keep in mind, Stephen, this is scenario number one. In this scenario, East Street and Nineveh would both go back to Junaluska. Everything on the underside of Waynesville, so that's Sulphur Springs Road, that's Chestnut Park, that's Love Lane and Dolan Road, everything in Bentonville Bottoms, all of that would go back to Hazelwood. Okay? So that would be the dividing line, right there's Russ Avenue,
Okay.
up to North Main.
It's Russ Avenue.
That's Russ Avenue and Main Street would be your dividing line, okay? We're-
And it, so is that pretty evenly split?
That split, if you look here on this side, would give 115 students to Hazelwood
Okay.
and 94 students to Junaluska. So it is pretty close, but it does give a few more students to the Hazelwood community.
Hazelwood is a little bigger.
Hazelwood had, you know, one of the things, that I told Dr. Nolte, I wanted to make sure we made this proposal works in all. I mean, this is not all gonna be a perfect picture. There's gonna be some pain points, you know, lunchroom pain points and some other places that you're gonna have to think about. It's not gonna be all roses, but there are some benefits to making this move. Many of them are financial benefits.
No,
but-
you don't have some pissed off people.
You say that a little louder for the camera.
So, that is option number one, which is the Main Street move. Keep in mind of those numbers, we'll look specifically at numbers in just a moment. Option number two, and even though I don't necessarily like option number two, I want you to think about it in terms of long-term flexibility with option number two, because what this option does is it gives basically East Street, Nineveh, and some of Dolan Road, and we can choose where that line is based on how many students we were to feel comfortable, but Dolan Road and Van Mill Bottoms in that area back to Junaluska, giving more students to Junaluska than we were to give to Hazelwood. The reason that I put this scenario in there was this scenario, by giving more students to Junaluska, keep in mind when we look at our district map, if we were to grow again, Hazelwood has absolutely no school to hand students off to at this point, and except for Junaluska, and we're bringing Junaluska's capacity up. What this scenario does is it gives Junaluska more students, which also then gives you some flexibility in the Riverbend area and in the Jonathan Valley area to bring those districts a little bit closer this way to take capacity away. If our county numbers were to grow in the future, and you were to have to make some adjustments to district lines to somehow alleviate some of that stress that a school might have. So just keep that in the back of your mind. That is the reason. I don't necessarily like this one as well, but I felt like it needed to be in there because that has to be a consideration, is what it looks like, not next year, but 5, 6, 7 years from now, if our enrollment numbers were to go up and you were to have overcrowding at one of those schools. This scenario would give you some flexibility in overcrowding.
Do we have numbers of projected?
Yeah, I'm gonna get
Okay.
those, well, I'm not gonna get to necessarily projected growth numbers, but I'll give you the numbers of where these scenarios would put us if we were to do this today.
Oh,
And
Okay.
then Rhonda, each of those schools have land where you can actually build additional classrooms if you
Oh,
needed to.
right, okay.
What is the capacity right now?
If you'll give us just a second, when I
You
get to
got
the
it.
spreadsheets, we'll get to
Okay.
that. All right, third scenario. The third scenario is almost identical to the first scenario as far as numbers. In fact, it is exactly identical, the number of students going to Hazelwood and the students going to Junaluska. The only difference is that this is more of a northwest division rather than a north-south division rather than an east-west division. So basically, we would take Pigeon Street and 276 coming up to Main Street as a dividing line, go out, let's say, and I'm just picking a road, Church Street, back down to the bottom of the hill, and then divide back up toward the bypass there, making it a north-south line. So all of Dolan Road, all of Love Lane, all of Van Mill Bottoms, all of East Street, all of that area would go back to Junaluska. It would be easily accessible by Howell Mill Road, so it's not gonna be a really far commute. Yeah. And then everything south of that line would then go back to Hazelwood. Logically, that's another option that's easy to see how that would make sense. And so that gives you three, I wanted to give you three visual images that you could see of what it might look like to begin with if we were to do this.
Did you study the bus efficiency?
It's gonna be a wash. It's gonna cost us just a little bit more to run buses because in some places, those buses are gonna have to travel farther from Junaluska to Nineveh or from Junaluska to Love Lane than Central's traveling right now. But that's not gonna be far. I mean, you're talking about, maybe a mile and a half, and at $2 a mile, we're looking at, maybe a $10,000 swing in making this move, $10,000 or $15,000 swing, but it's not something that's not manageable when we look at what the savings on the other
But
side
then
might
you'll
be.
have our droppers too.
Right.
Hopefully that program we just implemented in the past last
Well,
session will help.
Well, and here's the other thing too, is that there's some cap room at both those schools on buses. And so right now we have 3 buses at Central. If we were to close, my gut says that I could take 1 bus and put it at Junaluska, 1 bus at Hazelwood, and still get those students home in a reasonable amount of time. And take the other bus, and it'll probably have to go to Wayne's Middle School because some of those buses are sharing buses. After they get through with their route at Central, they run up Wayne's Middle route. And by doing that, because we're gonna have to help protect Wayne's Middle School in this and make sure those kids don't get home any later.
Let me add something to Lynn's question, too, about, studying the bus routes. One of the arguments, should you choose to close Central Elementary School, because you may be asked why not other schools, is that this is a school that is over and between 2 schools that are really close, and you don't add cost in transportation. When you look at other schools to close, you're busing people a long way, and you're adding cost with transportation. Here, you're just not adding the transportation cost like you would in any other scenario.
That's a very good point.
Well, it's just something else, should you go that way, it's just something else to remember.
All right, and so the next thing that Joe and I did, pulling the numbers that he had together with the numbers that we had from our 10-day numbers. So what we started with on each of these options were the 10-day ADM from each of these schools. And then we took the 248 students that would have went to Central. And, oh goodness gracious, I'm sorry. How's that?
Looks like you wasted a lot of time today on that chart.
So, current number of students at the school, if we add those students from Central, this is option 1. Remember, option 1 was basically using Main Street as the dividing line. What their total would be, you'll see that Hazelwood came up to 577 students, and Junaluska came up to 430 students. You can see they're 90% capacity, and you know, some of the other people that have been principals in school can talk about that. You know, 90% is getting pretty packed. When you get to that 90, we may say that the school will hold 750 kids, but when we get up there above that 90% capacity, you start running into, you know, 2.5-hour lunch times, and you know, those are some things we really need to look closely at, is can we get all the kids fed in a reasonable amount of time? If we were to make that move, you know, is there room for those students classroom-wise?
Yeah, and,
oh,
cause you're using some classrooms for
Yeah.
EC where you just have 2 students,
Title
so,
I.
Yeah.
and all that, and.
It just takes a lot of flexibility away once you move past that 90% mark. And so you can see what percentage of that capacity. That's not the percentage of full that you're looking at there. That is the percentage of their 90%. That's how close they are to 90%. Because I think at 90%, we need to be having conversations about what, I mean, I'm not speaking for Joe, we need to be having conversations when we get to that, you know, when we met that 90% mark. Question?
I do have a question. Have we looked at if we're gonna start moving those lines for, you know, to Junaluska and to Hazelwood, are we also gonna look at maybe the outside lines of Junaluska, maybe some of those kids maybe going to Clyde to pick up?
I'll talk a little bit about that. I think that the most logical move, and when, this was my thought, I wanted to be very careful with, and I told Joe that when we looked at the other side of that line, if we're going to do what Dee Wee said we were gonna do, we want to be careful not to do it too much. We might want to look at how we navigate Jonathan Valley and Riverbend's district lines before we touch Clyde's district lines, because that then begins to affect. I mean, we've got kids that Edwards Road.
Yes.
In reality, Edwards Road is viewable from Tuscola Hill, and if you live right of that mark, you go to Clyde. And so I think we've got to be really, really careful. My caution is to be really, really careful about moving that line any farther toward Tuscola High School, because that's just not one of those conversations that anybody wants to engage in.
But we did talk about, you know, the Ivy Hill being
Thank you,
in the
Tom.
Jonathan Valley,
Yeah.
because that's the logical.
Yeah, I mean, because it's,
You know, and really the covered wagon aisle is Junaluska, you know, that's always been ridiculous.
You can't go right there.
Yeah, 'cause Jonathan Valley.
Just right down the road.
Yeah.
well, you know, you wouldn't move the lines drastically, but, you know.
Well, the thought that I would have, would be, if you look at Riverbend moving back closer to town,
Where
and
does Riverbend stop at now coming this way?
I would have to, I have not looked at that line in a long, long time, but I wanna
I
say
think
it's
it's
very close.
interstate pretty much.
It's
Yeah,
close to the
covered.
truck stop.
Yeah. that's
Oh, it
pretty-
is?
Yeah. So you could move
Move it
back
on
this
back,
way
yeah.
and gain some students without having a lot of impact, just like with Jonathan Valley, who, you know, Delwood Hill is really, right there on Delwood Hill is where Jonathan Valley stops, and you can move it back to the red light. Right now, if you moved it to the red light and took those students from Junaluska, you'd gain about 10 or 12 students, just 10 or 12. But you would, you know, over time, as you begin to do that, you could begin to alleviate stress. This is why I put option 2 in there, is because option 2, even though it grows the numbers at Junaluska just a little bit more, the option 2, see, they're almost at 90%, but I put that in there because I wanted you to make sure you understood that if we move this direction, Hazelwood is locked in, they're landlocked as far as adjusting their lines. Junaluska does have some area to flex if you were to move Riverbend's line or you were to move Jonathan Valley's line. You could eliminate some of the stress that Junaluska was having without having to incur funds to build a new building. And you can see that both of those schools are in the 60, 61, 62% capacity.
You like the way I'm raising your hand. Should you go this way, I'm just thinking about everything that we are gonna have to do just with the 2.4 million reduction in teacher non-renewals and program cuts and maybe ripping some teachers. And, certainly you can move other lines, but if you just eliminate the central district and create a line, you're only dealing with those families. If we moved Clyde's line, Jonathan Valley's line, Riverbend's line, quickly, we're going to have lots of other students that we've got to tell them they've got to move now. So if you move those lines, I would like to suggest that you do something that we did about 15 years ago when we worked to move the Clyde line and make Pisgah and Tuscaloosa the same size. If you move the Riverbend and Junaluska lines that